Covent Garden, London. It's a Friday evening when Victoria Sterling, a 32-year-old multimillionaire entrepreneur, is dining alone at the most exclusive restaurant in the square, surrounded by waiters in tuxedos and dishes that cost more than an average salary. Her £3,000 Stella McCartney dress gleams under the golden lights as she savors lobster and Dom Perignon champagne. Suddenly, a girl of about 15 with a black blindfold over her eyes and worn clothes timidly approaches her table. With a trembling but dignified voice, she asks, "Excuse me, madam, do you have any food you could share? I haven't eaten for 2 days." Victoria's response in that moment won't just be a gesture of charity, but the beginning of a transformation that will reveal a secret buried for years and forever change both their lives, proving that sometimes fate hides behind the most unexpected encounters. Victoria Sterling sat at the finest table in Rule's restaurant, the most prestigious establishment in Covent Garden, watching through the historic windows as the golden sunset reflected across London's rooftops. At 32, she was one of Britain's wealthiest entrepreneurs, owner of a luxury hotel chain stretching from London to Edinburgh. Her empire was worth over £200 million, and that evening she was celebrating alone her latest success, acquiring a historic mansion in Belgravia. She wore a cream-colored Stella McCartney dress she'd purchased that morning for £3,000. Tiffany bracelets sparkled at her wrists, and around her neck hung a pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. Every detail of her appearance screamed success, wealth, power. But whilst she savored the lobster accompanied by Dom Perignon champagne, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had accompanied her for years. Her life was a succession of business meetings, private jet travel, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and nights in presidential suites. She had everything money could buy, but no one to share it with. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 25, leaving her the family hotel empire. She had no siblings, and her romantic relationships always ended the same way. Men loved her for her money, not for who she truly was. That evening she had chosen to dine alone, because it hurt less than the false company of people interested only in her wealth. As she cut a piece of lobster, her thoughts drifted to her childhood when she lived with her grandparents in a small Cotswolds village before her parents brought her into the golden world of business. Back then, she was happy with little: an ice cream, a walk through lavender fields, the stories her grandfather told her in the evenings. But those memories belonged to another life, to a Victoria who no longer existed. Today's Victoria was a perfect money-making machine, a successful woman who had sacrificed her soul on the altar of business. She hadn't cried for years, didn't laugh from the heart anymore, no longer felt those authentic emotions that make a person human. The waiter brought her the second course, accompanied by a 1985 vintage port. Victoria nodded absent-mindedly, checking her phone for the umpteenth time to see if there were urgent emails. Even on holiday, even during meals, work never left her alone. She had become a slave to her own success. She glanced at her Cartier watch. It was 8 o'clock in the evening, and the square was filling with tourists and Londoners out for their evening stroll. Through the windows, she saw couples holding hands, families with children running between the pigeons, elderly people sitting on benches chatting. Everyone seemed to have something she lacked: the ability to enjoy small moments, to be happy without needing to possess everything. But Victoria had learned to bury these melancholic thoughts. She poured herself another glass of champagne and refocused on the documents she'd brought with her. The new hotel had to open before Christmas, and there were 1,000 details to sort out. Work was the only thing that still gave her a sense of control over life. She didn't know that a few meters away, a girl with a black blindfold over her eyes was watching her through the restaurant windows, finding the courage to take the step that would forever change both their existences. Sophie Thompson was 15 years old, but looked older because of everything she'd had to face in life. She'd become blind 3 years earlier due to a brain tumor that doctors had managed to remove, saving her life but taking away her sight forever. Her parents, factory workers from a small town in Yorkshire, couldn't afford the medical expenses and lost their home. Sophie now lived in a care home for troubled youth in South London, but that evening she had escaped for the third time in 2 months. She could no longer bear the home's routine, the rigid rules, the pity in the social worker's eyes. She'd taken the tube to London with the few pounds she'd managed to save, hoping to find work, a family that would take her in, anything that would give her a chance at normal life. But after 2 days wandering the city, she'd run out of money and eaten nothing except a sandwich a kind tourist had offered her the day before. Now she walked through Covent Garden with her white cane, guided by the sounds and scents around her. She heard the elegant chatter of expensive restaurant customers, the aroma of refined dishes that made her even hungrier, the rustle of costly clothes, and the clinking of crystal glasses. It was a completely different world from the one she'd known. She stopped outside Rule's restaurant, drawn by the irresistible aroma coming from the kitchen. Through the open windows she heard the sound of refined conversations, the clinking of cutlery on porcelain plates, the fizzing of champagne being poured into glasses. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to sit at one of those tables, to order anything from the menu without having to look at the price. But then, reality brought her back to earth. She was a blind girl, without family, without money, without future. Yet hunger was stronger than pride. Sophie hadn't eaten for 48 hours and felt her legs trembling with weakness. She gathered all the courage she had and approached the restaurant windows. Through the sounds, she managed to identify a table where someone sat alone, a woman, judging by the perfume and rustle of fabric. She heard that she was eating something, and that there were several plates on the table. Sophie tapped gently on the window glass. A few people turned around, and she heard murmurs of disapproval. But she didn't give up. With a trembling but dignified voice, she spoke the words she'd rehearsed 100 times in her mind. "Excuse me, madam. Do you have any food you could share? I haven't eaten for 2 days." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Sophie remained motionless, her heart beating so loudly she feared it could be heard even from the other side of the glass. But what happened next exceeded all her expectations. She heard the sound of a chair moving, footsteps approaching the window, then a female voice saying, "Wait, don't go. I'm coming out." Victoria stood up from the table so quickly she almost knocked over the champagne glass. She didn't know what had driven her to react this way to the blind girl's request. Perhaps it was the dignity in her voice. Perhaps the courage she must have had to ask for help. Or perhaps something deeper she couldn't yet understand. She left the restaurant ignoring the curious looks of other customers and approached the girl waiting motionless on the pavement. Up close, she could better see her situation. The clothes were clean but worn, the shoes damaged but carefully polished, the brown hair tied in a neat ponytail despite everything. She wasn't homeless, but a girl going through a difficult time trying to maintain her dignity. Victoria seated Sophie at her table and ordered a series of dishes. A warm soup to start, then pasta with tomatoes, roast chicken with sides, and fresh bread. While they waited, she began to discover Sophie's story. The illness, the loss of sight, the family's economic difficulties, the care home, the escape. When the food arrived, Sophie ate with a natural elegance that surprised Victoria. She didn't wolf down the food as one might expect from someone who hadn't eaten for days, but savored each bite with gratitude. She had good manners, was polite, intelligent. You could tell she came from a decent family, simply unlucky. Sophie told her that before she'd wanted to become a photographer, but now she dreamed only of being useful for something, having a normal life, being able to work, having a home, perhaps a family someday. Victoria was impressed by Sophie's determination. At 15, after losing everything, she still spoke of future, hopes, dreams. After a long pause, Victoria made a decision that surprised even herself. She proposed that Sophie come live with her. She had a large house, she could continue her studies, and in exchange she could help her with certain things. Sophie was speechless, incredulous. Victoria herself didn't know exactly why she was doing this, but looking at Sophie, she saw something she'd lost: authenticity, strength of character, the ability to find hope even in despair. She had the feeling that Sophie could teach her something she'd forgotten. 3 days after that encounter in Covent Garden, Sophie found herself in Victoria's Manor overlooking Lake Windermere in the Lake District, still incredulous at the turn her life had taken. The house was an 18th-century estate, surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens, with a breathtaking view of the fells that framed the lake. Victoria had assigned her a suite on the second floor, larger than the entire flat where Sophie had lived with her parents. But what had impressed Sophie most were the details. Victoria had tactile handrails installed along all the corridors, replaced all carpets with non-slip ones, arranged the furniture so Sophie could move freely without obstacles. Victoria had kept her promise. Sophie had resumed her studies with a private tutor specializing in education for the visually impaired, was learning Braille and computer use with specific software. But most importantly, for the first time in years, she felt part of a family. What neither expected was how much they would enrich each other. Sophie brought into Victoria's life something money had never been able to buy: authenticity. Mornings they woke together, had breakfast on the terrace, talking about everything and nothing. Sophie told stories of her childhood in Yorkshire. Victoria shared anecdotes from the business world that Sophie found fascinating. Sophie had a particular way of seeing the world, not being influenced by appearances.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
She judged people by what they said, how they treated her, the energy they transmitted. During business meetings Victoria held at home, Sophie could understand within minutes who was honest and who wasn't, who was truly competent and who was bluffing. One day, during an important meeting, Sophie whispered to Victoria that one of her collaborators was lying about the Manchester project figures. Victoria initially thought Sophie was wrong, but after having the accounts checked, she discovered the man had inflated costs by at least 30%. From that moment, she began involving Sophie in many of her business decisions. But the biggest change occurred in Victoria's personal life. Sophie was teaching her to rediscover simple pleasures: the scent of garden flowers in the morning, the sound of rain on the lake, the taste of the housekeeper's homemade bread. Things Victoria had always had around her, but no longer noticed. One day, whilst walking in the garden, Sophie asked Victoria a question that struck her deeply. She asked why she was always so sad, even when she smiled. Victoria replied that she wasn't sad, just tired of everything. Work, responsibilities, having to be perfect all the time. Sophie remained silent for a moment, then observed that when she became blind, she thought her life was over. But then she understood she'd simply lost one way of seeing the world, not the ability to live it. Perhaps Victoria had lost another way of seeing. She had everything that wasn't needed, and had nothing of what was truly important. That question stayed in Victoria's mind for days. Sophie was right. She'd built an empire, but forgotten how to be happy. 6 months after their meeting, Victoria and Sophie's lives had found perfect balance. Sophie had resumed her studies with extraordinary success, and Victoria had begun delegating more work to spend time with her. They'd developed a daily routine that gave serenity to both: breakfast together, morning studies, afternoon walks, dinners during which they shared their days. But that tranquility was suddenly shattered by a phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Victoria's phone rang. On the other end was a man who introduced himself as Dr. Williams, the doctor who had treated Sophie during her illness. The doctor said he needed to speak to her about something very important regarding the girl, and preferred to do so in person. The next day, he appeared at the manor with a medical file under his arm and a serious expression on his face. Victoria received him in her study, whilst Sophie was in the garden with her tutor. Dr. Williams began explaining that during the treatment period, they had conducted all necessary genetic tests. They had discovered that Sophie wasn't the biological daughter of the Thompson family, but had been adopted when she was a few months old. But there was more. Through DNA tests, they had managed to trace her true family of origin. Sophie is your sister, Mrs. Sterling. Your twin sister, to be exact. Victoria's world seemed to stop. The doctor explained that her parents had had 2 daughters. They had kept her and given Sophie up for adoption to a family who couldn't have children. They probably never told her to protect her. Victoria stood up from her chair, walking to the window overlooking the garden. She saw Sophie sitting under a tree, listening to the tutor reading her a book. Now she understood why they'd felt so connected from the first moment, why Sophie had given her that sensation of familiarity. The doctor explained that probably her parents wanted to protect her from pain, and perhaps planned to tell her everything when she was older, but then died in the accident. All the puzzle pieces now fit together. The feeling of emptiness she'd always felt, as if something essential was missing. The instinctive need to help Sophie, the ease with which they'd understood each other. Victoria asked if Sophie knew anything, and the doctor replied no. The decision to tell her was hers, but he'd thought she had the right to know, especially considering how close they'd become. Victoria remained silent for long minutes, watching the girl she now knew was her sister. She thought back to all the shared moments of recent months, how Sophie had changed her life, how she'd taught her to find herself again. Finally, she decided that Sophie had endured enough trauma in her life, and she didn't want to upset her with this revelation unless absolutely necessary. For now, she preferred it remain their secret. That evening, during dinner, Sophie seemed to notice Victoria was quieter than usual, and asked if everything was all right. Victoria looked at her with completely new eyes. Her sister, the person she'd unconsciously searched for her entire life, had always been there, just kilometers away, living a difficult life whilst she grew up in luxury. She lied gently, saying everything was fine, that she was just thinking about how fortunate she'd been to meet her. Sophie smiled. That smile Victoria now recognized as identical to her own, and said she felt fortunate too. Victoria took Sophie's hand across the table, whispering that perhaps it was destiny they'd met. A year after Dr. Williams's revelation, Victoria had still kept Sophie's identity secret to herself. During this period, their relationship had deepened even further, transforming into something that went beyond friendship or even familial affection. It was a soul connection that both felt but couldn't fully explain. Sophie had turned 17 and become an extraordinary young woman. She'd finished college with excellent grades and was preparing for university. She wanted to study psychology, specializing in helping people with disabilities, saying she wanted to help others as Victoria had helped her. But above all, Sophie had completely transformed Victoria's life. The hotel empire continued to flourish, but now Victoria had found balance between work and private life. She'd opened a foundation to help young people in difficulty, inspired by Sophie's story. She'd begun traveling less and enjoying the house by the lake, the gardens, the small daily pleasures Sophie had taught her to appreciate. One evening, whilst sitting on the terrace watching the sunset over the lake, Sophie made a confession to Victoria. She said that initially she thought she'd helped her only out of kindness, or perhaps from the guilt of the rich towards the poor, but now she knew it wasn't so. Sophie explained that Victoria had saved her because she needed to save herself too, and she had needed Victoria as much as Victoria had needed her. It was as if they'd always been connected somehow, the way they understood each other without speaking, how they always managed to know what the other was thinking. The fact that she felt at home with her like nowhere else. It was as if they were family. Victoria remained silent for a long moment. it was time to tell the truth. And so, under the stars reflecting in the lake, Victoria told Sophie everything she'd discovered a year earlier. She spoke of parents who'd made a difficult choice, of separation at birth, of the destiny that had reunited them so improbably. Sophie listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. When Victoria finished speaking, she remained motionless for a long time, then whispered that now she understood. She understood why she'd always felt as if a piece was missing. Why, with Victoria, she felt complete. They embraced, crying together for all the lost years, but also smiling for the miracle that had reunited them. Two sisters who had lived completely different lives, but who had found in each other what they didn't even know they'd lost. Sophie made Victoria promise they would never separate again, and Victoria promised her they'd lost too many years and would now make up for all the lost time. In the months that followed, Victoria officially adopted Sophie, giving her the surname Sterling. Sophie began university, but continued living at the manor by the lake. Together they transformed part of the property into a reception center for young people in difficulty, a place where youth like Sophie could find a second chance. The story of their meeting and discovery became famous throughout Britain. Newspapers and television wanted to interview the sisters whom fate had separated and reunited so extraordinarily. But Victoria and Sophie preferred their private life, dedicating themselves to each other and the young people they helped. During one of their evening walks along the lake, Victoria confessed she'd learned that sometimes you must lose everything to find what truly matters. She'd had success, money, power, but hadn't had love. Sophie had lost her sight, family, home, but had maintained the ability to love. Together, they'd found what both had been missing. Sophie smiled, squeezing her sister's hand tightly, and replied that she'd learned sometimes angels disguise themselves as millionaires, dining alone in luxury restaurants. They laughed together, watching their shadows reflected in the lake water. Two sisters who had crossed darkness to find each other in the light, proving that true love knows no obstacles and that destiny, when it wants, can be stronger than any separation. 5 years later, Sophie graduated in psychology with top honors. On graduation day, Victoria was in the front row applauding her, eyes full of pride and love. Sophie had kept her promise. She now helped hundreds of people through the foundation they'd created together. After the ceremony, whilst embracing surrounded by flowers and congratulations, Sophie thanked Victoria for coming out of that restaurant, for answering her call, for giving her back not just a life, but a family. Victoria held her tight, knowing she too had to give thanks. Sophie had taught her that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in love, understanding, and the ability to improve others' lives. And when people asked them the secret of their happiness, they always answered the same thing. They'd learned that sometimes to find yourself, you must first save someone else. The manor by the lake had become much more than a home. It had become a symbol of hope for all those young people who believed they'd lost everything. Sophie and Victoria had proved that no matter how dark the path might seem, there's always someone ready to extend a hand. And sometimes that hand belongs to the person you've been searching for your entire life. Every evening, sitting on the terrace overlooking the lake, the two sisters silently thanked that magical moment in Covent Garden when a blind girl had the courage to knock on a window and a lonely millionaire had the heart to open it. Because sometimes the greatest miracles are born from the simplest gestures, and the purest love is found where you least expect it. If this story has moved you, give it a like. Share in the comments. Do you believe in destiny? Have you ever made a gesture of kindness that changed a life? Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories proving how love can emerge from the most unexpected encounters. Remember, sometimes the people we think we're helping are the ones who are actually saving us. True wealth lies in human connections, not in bank accounts.